If you think prisons are built to rehabilitate, remember this: Pelican Bay wasn't designed for second chances, only total control. Today, we're stepping inside the minds that engineered one of America's most feared Supermaxes, and the unintended nightmare that followed. Before we open these doors, hit that subscribe button. This is the kind of story they never want publicly told. Long before Pelican Bay State Prison became a national symbol of isolation, violence, and psychological warfare, its story began on a table, one covered in blueprints, security schematics, and stark warnings from California officials who were running out of places to put the most dangerous men in the state. By the late 1970s and early 80s, California's prison population had exploded. Gangs like the Aryan Brotherhood, Mexican Mafia, and Black Guerrilla Family were no longer just inmate groups. They had evolved into powerful criminal organizations controlling narcotics, extortion, and murders both inside and outside prison walls. The state's traditional maximum security prisons, San Quentin, Folsom, Soledad, were buckling under the pressure. Violence was rising, riots were common, and wardens were desperate for a solution. That solution, however, would not come from a politician or a prison guard. It came from a select group of criminal justice architects, designers, and correction strategists, people whose work usually stayed invisible, hidden behind the steel gates they built. These were the architects of Pelican Bay, the ones tasked with designing a place so secure, so psychologically overwhelming, and so technologically advanced for its time that even the most feared gang leaders could no longer operate from within it. They were told to build a prison that could stop communication like cutting a nerve. A facility capable of stripping power from inmates who had turned prison yards into war zones. What they ultimately created would become one of the most controversial and studied Supermax prisons in American history. Their challenge began with the location. Officials wanted a site far from major cities, far from escape routes, and far from anything resembling civilization. After scouting dozens of potential regions, they chose Crescent City, a remote northern corner of California surrounded by redwood forests, constant fog, and the Pacific Ocean's freezing winds. The land was desolate, the weather brutal, and access limited. For the architects, it was perfect. Isolation wasn't a feature, it was the foundation. Once the location was locked, the team began studying the behavior of high-risk inmates. They weren't just designing cells. They were designing systems to neutralize human behavior, patterns of communication, movement, and influence. They analyzed how contraband moved from cell to cell, how gang leaders sent orders through coded letters, how messages were passed with hand signs, and even how inmates communicated through plumbing pipes. Every weakness in every past prison became a data point. From this research came the prison's most infamous creation, the Security Housing Unit, better known as the SHU. But what the world would eventually call the SHU started as a sterile, chilling concept in the architect's early notes: windowless environment, zero direct contact, perpetual surveillance, sensory deprivation optional. They would build it in a shape resembling an X, with each wing stretching outward like the rigid arms of a star. This layout minimized blind spots, forced predictable inmate movement, and made escape nearly impossible. But the real innovation was silence. Thick concrete, angled hallways, and acoustic dampening meant inmates could scream at the top of their lungs and the sound would barely travel. Throughout the design process, the architects asked themselves a question that haunted them: how far is too far when it comes to controlling danger? They weren't building an ordinary prison. They were architecting the mind, controlling it, breaking its patterns, restricting the flow of information until even the strongest inmate leaders were cut off from their armies. Yet none of them could predict what would happen once the SHU was operating at full force. They didn't foresee how inmates would adapt, how silence could become a weapon of its own, how psychological pressure could twist the mind, or how the world outside would one day accuse them of constructing a place that crossed the line between punishment and torture. Back then, all they knew was the mission: build a fortress that fear itself could not penetrate. A place where the state's most violent and influential inmates could be contained. A place that would later be whispered about in courtrooms, documentaries, gang meetings, and human rights hearings. And when construction finally began, the people of Crescent City didn't realize the structure rising from the fog would become one of the most infamous correctional institutions in the United States. Nor did the architects know that decades later, their creation would stand at the center of hunger strikes, lawsuits, and nationwide debates about solitary confinement. But before Pelican Bay became a battleground of ethics and control, it was simply an idea drawn by the architects who believed they were saving lives, preventing chaos, and solving a crisis that had spiraled beyond traditional corrections. They created Pelican Bay to stop violence. In doing so, they unleashed something else entirely. When the first trucks rolled into Crescent City carrying steel beams, concrete mixers, and heavy machinery, locals gathered along the narrow roads to watch. Most had never seen a construction project of this scale. Massive cranes towering above the coastline, construction lights glowing through the morning fog, and hundreds of workers arriving daily like a migrating army. To the people of Del Norte County, the prison promised jobs, stability, and government money. What they didn't know was that they were about to host one of the most psychologically engineered environments in the country. Before any concrete was poured, the architects walked the untouched land, marshy terrain bordered by redwoods older than the United States itself. They studied how the fog moved, how the wind cut across the empty fields, how rain pooled in the low ground. Every natural element was analyzed, because even the environment would play a role. Isolation wasn't only geographical, it was atmospheric. The architects noted how the fog thickened at dawn, how the silence in the area was almost unsettling, how the land seemed to swallow sound. They realized nature itself would support their design. Pelican Bay would not simply be built in isolation, it would breathe isolation. Construction crews began carving out the foundation for what would become two separate worlds, the general population and the Security Housing Unit, SHU. The architects insisted on reinforcing the SHU with extra layers of concrete and steel, creating walls so thick they blocked nearly all external noise. Temperature fluctuations were minimal, light was controlled artificially, airflow was regulated by industrial ventilation. Everything would be predictable, contained, controlled. They wanted a place where inmates could not rely on their senses to maintain a normal rhythm of life. In the general population yard, design choices reflected a different philosophy. Here, there would be movement, work, programs, and recreation. But even this section was built with the Pacific winds in mind. The yards were placed where sharp gusts could sweep across them, making extended gatherings uncomfortable. The architects knew that when inmates stayed cold, they moved less, grouped less, planned less. As construction progressed, the state sent security consultants to inspect the blueprints. Many were retired wardens and officers from San Quentin and Folsom, men who had first-hand experience with violent uprisings. They recommended additional features, restricted sightlines, reinforced doors, and electronic control panels capable of locking down entire wings at the push of a button. The architects integrated these ideas, evolving Pelican Bay into something far beyond a conventional prison. What was taking shape was the next generation of Supermax philosophy, extreme isolation as a tool for behavioral control. Some design choices sparked quiet debates among the architects. How small should the SHU skylights be? Should inmates be allowed to see the sky? Should cells be angled to avoid human contact? These weren't just questions of structure, they were questions of morality. One architect, normally quiet, finally broke during a design meeting and asked, "If we remove every trace of humanity, what does that make us?" The room fell silent. But the project continued. By 1987, the outer shell of Pelican Bay stood like a concrete monolith rising from the fog. Locals began calling it the fortress. From a distance, it looked more like a military base than a prison. High walls, guard towers, razor wire glistening under coastal rain. The surrounding forest had been cleared, leaving a vast perimeter of open land that acted as a natural buffer zone. If anyone tried to escape, they would be exposed, visible, and swallowed by the cold wilderness. Inside the emerging SHU, the cell blocks took shape, narrow hallways, long corridors of steel doors, and an eerie quiet even during construction. Workers said the place felt dead. Some joked the silence was a sign, a warning that they were building something unnatural. Those jokes eventually stopped, because the deeper the cell pods were built, the more the environment seemed to absorb sound. Voices didn't echo. Footsteps didn't carry. Even tools clanging against concrete seemed muffled. The architects had succeeded. Silence wasn't just engineered, it became structural. The most controversial feature, though, was the exercise pods. Instead of open yards, SHU inmates would be placed in small concrete enclosures with high walls and a mesh screen above. These pods allowed inmates to walk in circles for an hour a day, but they couldn't see the horizon. They couldn't see other inmates. They couldn't even see the full sky. Freedom of movement was technically provided, but the experience felt like pacing in a giant concrete box. As Pelican Bay neared completion, word spread through California's prison system. Inmates at other institutions whispered about the new place up north where gang shot callers would disappear into permanent lockdown. Guards spoke about it as the answer to decades of chaos. Human rights groups worried it was the beginning of something darker. By the time the final inspection took place, Pelican Bay State Prison had become more than a facility. It was the physical manifestation of fear, strategy, and control. It was designed to restrict communication, break power structures, and contain the most dangerous inmates in the state. What the architects didn't yet understand was that they weren't just building a prison. They were building an experiment, one that would test the limits of human endurance and ignite national debate for years to come. And when Pelican Bay finally opened its gates, the experiment began. On December 1989, before the first inmate bus even arrived, Pelican Bay State Prison was already buzzing with tension. Staff walked the empty corridors of the SHU, testing the electronic controls, rehearsing emergency drills, and studying protocols so complex they felt more like military procedures than correctional routines. Officers selected to work here weren't chosen randomly. They were screened for discipline, psychological stability, and the ability to function under high stress. Even among veteran guards, Pelican Bay was seen as a test of endurance. The day the first buses rolled in, the gates groaned open with mechanical force, revealing a convoy of reinforced vehicles carrying some of the most feared inmates in California. These were gang architects, narcotics traffickers, prison hitmen, and longtime enforcers, men whose reputations alone had shaped policies. Their transfer orders described them as high-control risks, validated gang associates, and violent influencers. For California officials, this day symbolized a victory. For the inmates inside those buses, it marked the beginning of a new reality. As the buses approached the intake building, fog drifted across the yard like a curtain, amplifying the cold. The engines rumbled to a stop, and doors opened. Inmates stepped out shackled at the wrists, waist, and ankles, their movements slow and mechanical. Guards lined the walkway holding batons, restraints, and shotguns loaded with rubber rounds. The procession looked less like a prison transfer and more like a high-security military operation. Inside intake, the inmates immediately sensed something different. There was no noise. No chaotic shouting. No clatter of doors or echoing voices. The silence was so heavy it felt unnatural. Officers processed the arrivals with clinical precision: photos, fingerprints, medical checks, property inventory. Every movement followed a script. No one raised their voice, because in Pelican Bay, the building itself created an atmosphere where shouting felt out of place, almost disrespectful to the structure's design. Many inmates, hardened by years in San Quentin and Folsom, expected hostility. Instead, they found professionalism, cold, detached, emotionless. It was a different kind of control, one built on systems rather than intimidation. Some said that alone made Pelican Bay unsettling. You couldn't read the officers here, you couldn't sense weakness. Everything felt regulated. When the first group was escorted into the SHU, they realized the rumors were real. The corridor leading to the pods was windowless, long, and painfully quiet. Lights were bright but sterile, casting a clinical glow across the thick concrete walls. The air smelled faintly of metal and disinfectant. One inmate later described the walk as feeling like you're being swallowed by the building. The doors to each pod opened with an electronic buzz followed by a heavy thud, an unmistakable sound that echoed power. The cells themselves were compact, with a concrete bed, stainless steel sink, combination toilet, and a narrow slot for food trays. No bars. No open space. Everything was sealed behind a solid door with a small perforated section. Inmates could hear almost nothing from the cells beside them. Some paced immediately, trying to process the confinement. Others sat still, stunned by the sheer silence. The isolation hit fast. Even the toughest inmates felt the shift. One former gang member later said the moment he stepped into the SHU, he understood why people lost their minds in here. Meanwhile, in the general population area, inmates experienced a different shock. Instead of the familiar chaos of prison yards, Pelican Bay's strategy was structure. Movement was timed. Routes were rigid. Guards monitored every interaction. Even the layout prevented large gatherings. The housing blocks faced inward toward controlled yards, eliminating vantage points and blind spots. Officers stationed in secure booths oversaw entire sections without stepping foot on the floor. From the start, Pelican Bay was a place designed to eliminate unpredictability. On the administrative side, staff were learning the psychological impact as well. Officers noted how the silence made them hyper-aware of every sound, the shuffle of boots, the click of keys, even their own breathing inside the SHU corridors. The environment was affecting everyone, not just the inmates. Some guards admitted feeling unease, describing the SHU as a pressure chamber without air. Yet, for all the control Pelican Bay offered, inmates began adapting almost immediately. From their cells, they tested the limits, tapping messages through plumbing, using tightly rolled notes known as kites, even signaling through ventilation gaps. The architects had designed a fortress to break communication, but inmates had survived worse. They had built networks inside the most chaotic prisons in California. Now they would attempt the same in a silent one. By the first month, staff noticed subtle patterns: synchronized meal refusals, coordinated complaints, coded requests. The gang structure hadn't disappeared, it had simply gone underground, adapting to the new terrain like a species evolving under pressure. Pelican Bay was meant to isolate power. Instead, it was becoming the breeding ground for a more covert form of influence. Violence took on new forms, too. Instead of riots and yard stabbings, conflict manifested in psychological warfare, threats hidden in legal mail, coded messages in artwork, subtle intimidation during escorted showers. The battle had shifted, but it had not ended. As months passed, the architects who had designed the SHU visited the facility to observe how their creation functioned. Some were impressed by the efficiency. Others were disturbed by what they saw: men locked in near-total isolation for 22 to 24 hours a day, pacing in mental loops, staring at walls that drained the sense of time. One architect admitted privately that he felt as if he were standing inside a human experiment. Another wondered whether the structure had gone too far, whether the intention to control had evolved into something darker. What none of them fully grasped yet was that the real test hadn't begun. Because soon, Pelican Bay wouldn't just shape the inmates. It would reshape the entire debate about how America handles its most dangerous men. In the early months after Pelican Bay opened, the architects who had designed the facility were invited back for a formal evaluation. It was standard procedure. Government projects of this scale required post-construction review. But for the architects, this visit wasn't just procedural. It was personal. They had spent years on blueprints, debates, and simulations. Now they were walking through the living product of their decisions, stepping into a place that no longer existed on paper but pulsed with real human consequences. The moment they entered the SHU wing, the atmosphere struck them. They had known it would be silent. After all, they engineered that silence intentionally. But knowing something and experiencing it were two different realities. The air was cold, unmoving. The lighting was bright but lifeless, giving no sense of day or night. Concrete absorbed every sound, creating a stillness so unnatural that even their footsteps felt like intrusions. One of the senior architects paused, closed his eyes, and said quietly, "It feels like time doesn't move here." Officers escorted them through the X-shaped corridors. The architects observed the clean lines, the seamless concrete, the symmetrical angles, everything they had calculated to eliminate chaos. Yet as they walked deeper, they saw something they had not anticipated: human eyes staring through perforated steel. Some eyes were angry, others hollow. Some simply watched with a kind of detached curiosity. These men had been placed here because they were considered the most dangerous, the most influential, the most disruptive. But stripped of movement, stripped of contact, stripped of sound, they looked less like threats and more like trapped minds suspended in an environment purposely built to compress them. One architect, a man who had argued for natural light during the design phase, lingered near a cell door. He looked at the narrow skylight, the only access inmates had to the outside world. A cold rectangle of pale daylight filtered into the cell, illuminating nothing but concrete. "This," he murmured, "is barely the sky." Their guided tour continued into the control booths, glass enclosures where officers operated entire blocks with electronic panels. From here, guards could open doors, trigger alarms, dim lights, or lock down every cell in seconds. It was efficient, almost too efficient. The architects watched as a single officer manipulated the entire section with calm, practiced precision. The control panel resembled something from an industrial plant, not a prison. The architects realized that Pelican Bay wasn't just containing inmates, it was automating human management. In the general population units, the architects expected a different energy. But even here, something felt off. The environment was strict, orderly, and sterile. Movements were scheduled. Conversations were cautious. Officers monitored everything from elevated booths. There were no chaotic yards, no open gang meetings, no spontaneous outbursts, just a sense of tension pressing down on every interaction. The inmates walked in measured steps, understanding the unspoken rule: Pelican Bay wasn't like other prisons. Here, the building itself shaped behavior. A few architects felt a quiet pride. They saw a facility functioning exactly as intended: controlled, peaceful, and efficient. But others couldn't shake an unsettling thought: when you engineer an environment to restrict all chaos, you also restrict humanity. The evaluation moved into administrative offices where staff shared early observations. They reported fewer fights, fewer assaults, fewer disturbances. On paper, it looked like success. But then came the other side of the story, an increase in mental health complaints, inmates reporting paranoia, insomnia, hallucinations, and depressive symptoms. Medical staff described men pacing in tight circles for hours, whispering to themselves, or staring at walls as though the concrete might respond. One psychologist explained it bluntly: you can suppress behavior, but you can't suppress the mind. It will fill silence with something. The architects listened. Some took notes. Others stared at the table, absorbing the weight of the feedback. Then a veteran officer added something that hit even harder: these guys aren't the same after a few months in the SHU. I mean, they go in angry, but they come out disconnected. Even the shot callers start losing their edge. For prison officials, this was proof of effectiveness. But for the architects, it raised ethical questions. Was the SHU reducing violence, or eroding identity? Was the system rehabilitating, or simply breaking? One architect finally voiced the question hanging in the air: where is the line between controlling danger and creating suffering? No one had an answer. After the meeting, the architects toured the exercise pods, small concrete rectangles where inmates spent their 1 hour of daily outdoor time. The pods had high walls, allowing only a sliver of sky overhead. Standing inside one, the architects looked up. The opening revealed only drifting patches of grey. No trees. No horizon. No depth. Just a narrow strip of the world beyond the walls. "This is the only sky they get?" one architect asked. The warden nodded. For SHU inmates, yes. The architect's face tightened. It wasn't anger or guilt, it was realization. He had drawn the lines on the blueprint, but standing here, feeling the confinement, hearing the distant echo of metal doors shutting, the blueprint transformed into something he had never fully imagined. Before departing, the architects passed through the main corridor again. They heard a faint sound, tapping. Slow, rhythmic tapping coming from a cell. It was communication, a coded message, an inmate sending a signal through the walls. Despite all the isolation, all the engineering, all the control, inmates were finding ways to connect. It struck the architects deeply. The human will to communicate, to not vanish into silence, was stronger than their design. As they exited the facility and walked back into the fog, one architect stopped and looked at the massive structure behind him. "We built a fortress," he said. "But we also built a mirror. This place reflects us as much as them." He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. The others understood. Pelican Bay was no longer just an architectural achievement or a solution to violence. It had become a question. A question the architects would wrestle with for years. What happens when a structure designed to control human behavior begins to reshape the definition of humanity itself? For the first year of Pelican Bay's operation, officials believed they had achieved the unachievable, total control. In the SHU, inmates were isolated, silenced, and cut off from the networks that fueled violence throughout the California prison system. Officials celebrated the quiet, noting the absence of riots, stabbings, and coordinated attacks. But beneath that engineered silence, something else was forming, something the architects had not predicted and the administrators had not prepared for. Human beings adapt. Especially those who have survived the most violent prison yards in America. Inside the SHU, communication evolved like an underground species, adapting to the environment's harshest conditions. Inmates who once commanded armies now had to rely on ingenuity, memory, and subtlety. They studied the architecture not as inhabitants, but as tacticians. Every crack, every vent, every pipe became part of a new language. It began with tapping. A rhythm. A code. A pattern of knocks moving through the concrete skeleton of the building. The walls that were meant to isolate slowly became conduits of clandestine conversation. SHU inmates tapped messages through shared plumbing, through floor vibrations, through the hollow frames of their beds. To outsiders, the system seemed impossible. But to men who had once sent hit orders across miles of prison yards, decoding a tap pattern felt like basic training. Then came the fishing lines. Using strips of bed sheets, plastic wrappers, tightly rolled paper, or even strands of clothing, inmates crafted lines that could extend under their cell doors to exchange notes. They attached tiny folded papers, kites, weighted with toothpaste caps or rolled cardboard so they could slide across concrete floors and navigate tight corners. Conversations that would take seconds on the yard now took hours, sometimes days. But information flowed. Slowly. Strategically. Patiently. Officers discovered these lines occasionally, but for every fishing attempt intercepted, 10 more slipped by unnoticed. The SHU was not a place of quick movements, it was a world of precision. Inmates had time. Endless, empty time to perfect their craft. The strongest communication channel, though, came from an unexpected place, the ventilation system. The architects had built the ventilation ducts to be secure, reinforced, and noise-reducing. But no design could fully silence the movement of air. Inmates noticed that if they spoke in a whisper near the vent at a specific angle, the sound traveled faintly to neighboring cells. It wasn't loud. It wasn't clear. But it was enough. Enough to send messages. Enough to relay instructions. Enough to keep the structure of gang leadership alive. To prison officials, the SHU represented isolation. To the gangs, it became a strategic command center. Inmates began mapping the building in their minds, analyzing which cells shared vents, which pods echoed, which floors vibrated subtly when someone walked. They created mental blueprints more detailed than the architectural plans themselves. Even without windows, without clocks, without direct contact, they built an internal communication system that defied the very purpose of the facility. One high-ranking gang member, whose identity was later sealed in court documents, became the kingpin of this covert communication network. He had been sent to the SHU specifically to sever his influence. Instead, he used his isolation as an advantage. Hidden from yard politics, shielded from rival stabbings, and protected from informants, he structured a silent hierarchy through taps, whispers, and coded letters disguised as legal mail. He became more powerful in isolation than he ever was on the main line. This was not the outcome the architects intended. As months turned into years, staff began discovering patterns that didn't make sense. Simultaneous hunger strikes across pods with no known communication. Coordinated grievances filed by inmates who hadn't seen or spoken to one another in months. Even outside violence linked back to orders traced to the SHU. It was a paradox. Pelican Bay had restricted the body, but underestimated the mind. Investigators started monitoring outgoing mail, comparing handwriting, decoding symbols. They stationed officers in the corridors to listen for taps. They tried rotating inmates to disrupt communication patterns. But every time officials adapted, inmates adapted faster. Isolation had forced them to become innovators. Over time, the psychological toll of the SHU deepened this ingenuity. Men who spoke to no one for days at a time began hearing phantom whispers, then listening harder, trying to distinguish their imagination from real voices through the vents. Some conversations were real. Some weren't. But inmates leaned into any form of interaction, even if it blurred reality. In this environment, communication wasn't just a tool, it was survival. One inmate described the SHU as a place where silence gets loud. In that silence, any message, the faintest tap, the softest whisper, became oxygen. And so communication grew more sophisticated, not less. Whether officials liked it or not, the SHU had become a psychological battlefield where the most disciplined minds thrived. Meanwhile, word outside Pelican Bay was spreading. Families, lawyers, and activists began hearing rumors. Lawsuits emerged. Journalists made inquiries. A narrative was forming. If Pelican Bay had been designed to break communication, why were gang networks still functioning? And at what cost to the human beings trapped inside? What had started as an engineering marvel was becoming a national subject of concern. And when the architects learned about the unexpected adaptations of the inmates, about communication thriving in a place designed for silence, they realized something profound. They had built a fortress. But not even a fortress can stop the human mind from reaching outward. And soon, Pelican Bay's hidden communications would spark something far bigger than secret messages. They would ignite the beginning of a rebellion. In the end, Pelican Bay was never just concrete, steel, and surveillance. It was a question, one carved into every cell door, whispered through every vent, and echoed in every silent corridor. A question about power. About control. About what happens when a system designed to contain the most dangerous men begins reshaping the very definition of humanity. Beat. Some say Pelican Bay saved countless lives. Others call it the darkest chapter in modern corrections. But whether you see a fortress or a warning, one truth remains: prisons don't exist apart from us. They reflect us. Our fears. Our failures. Our choices. Slow fade to black. If this story opened your eyes, if it made you question what lies beyond the walls we build, then don't leave without subscribing. There are more stories hidden in America's darkest corners. Stories they don't want told, but we'll keep uncovering them, one chapter at a time. Thank you for watching. Stay aware. Stay questioning. And until next time, remember, the walls are always listening.